You know that moment when someone looks at you like you just handed them the moon, even though all you did was fix something that cost $3 at the hardware store? That's exactly what happened when Margaret opened her front door and realized her stubborn doorknob finally turned without requiring a wrestling match. But what she said next, that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Thursday in Riverside, California. The sun was already cooking the pavement by 7 a.m. I was loading my van with enough tools to rebuild half the neighborhood. My name's Jake Martinez, and for the past 4 years, I've been the guy people call when their house decides to fall apart one piece at a time. Not glamorous work, but honest work. And in a world where everything seems fake, I've found peace. In fixing things that actually matter to people's daily lives, I'd gotten the call 3 days earlier from a woman with a voice that sounded both confident and slightly exasperated. Her doorknob had been acting up for months, she explained, sticking so badly that she'd started using the back door just to avoid the daily battle. The front door was original to the house, built in 1968, and she didn't want to replace it if she could help it. Something about preserving the character of the home, she said. I respected that. Too many people these days just throw things away instead of trying to save them. The address led me to a quiet street lined with mature oak trees and modest ranch houses that had probably been the American dream back when Nixon was president. Number 42 was a cream-colored house with forest green shutters and a garden that looked like someone actually cared about it. Not the fake perfect lawn kind of caring, but the kind where you could tell someone spent weekend mornings out there with their coffee, deadheading roses and talking to the tomato plants. I parked the van and grabbed my toolbox, walking up a brick pathway that had been laid with care. The doormat said welcome friends in faded letters, and I could hear classical music drifting through the walls. Mozart, if I had to guess, though my knowledge of classical music came mostly from the dentist's office. When I knocked, the music stopped, and I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and there she stood. Margaret, mid-40s maybe. Late 40s, with auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun and paint smudges on her fingers. She was wearing jeans that looked like they'd seen actual work, and an oversized flannel shirt that probably belonged to someone else once upon a time.
Ow.
But it was her eyes that caught me off guard. Green eyes that seemed to see right through polite contractor smile I usually wore. You must be Jake, she said, extending a paint-stained hand. I'm Margaret. Thanks for coming out on such short notice. Her handshake was firm, direct, and lasted just long enough to be memorable without being awkward. No problem at all. Mind if I take a look at the troublemaker? She stepped aside, and I got my first real look at the interior of the house. It was like stepping into someone's actual life instead of a magazine spread. Books everywhere, not arranged for show, but clearly read and loved. Art supplies scattered across a dining room table. Canvases leaning against walls showing half-finished paintings of landscapes and street scenes. The kind of organized chaos that spoke of a creative mind at work. Sorry about the mess, she said, following my gaze. I'm an art teacher and I tend to bring my work home with me. I don't apologize, I said, genuinely meaning it. This is what a home should look like, lived in. She smiled at that, and I noticed the way it changed her whole face. Not just polite anymore, but warm. Real. The doorknob was indeed a stubborn piece of hardware. Original brass, tarnished with age, but still solid underneath. When I tried to turn it from the inside, it caught and ground like it was full of sand. The mechanism was probably just worn and needed cleaning. Maybe some new springs, but I could see why it had been driving her crazy. How long has it been doing this? Asked, kneeling down to examine the lock mechanism. About 6 months, but it's gotten worse in the last few weeks. Some days I have to use both hands and throw my whole body weight into it. She demonstrated, and I could see the frustration in her movements. My neighbor keeps telling me to just replace the whole door, but this house has been in my family for 30 years. My parents bought it when I was in high school. Seems wrong to just give up on it. There was something in the way she said it that made me look up from the lock. Family history, generational connection, the weight of preserving something meaningful. I understood that more than she knew. We can definitely save it, I said. Might take a couple visits to get it perfect, but these old mechanisms were built to last. It just needs some attention. While I worked, she hovered nearby, not in an annoying way, but like someone genuinely curious about the process. She asked good questions about how locks worked, about the difference between modern hardware and vintage pieces, about why some things lasted decades while others fell apart in years. I found myself explaining more than I usually did, enjoying the way she listened with real interest. You know a lot about old houses, she observed, as I carefully disassembled the lock mechanism on her dining room table. I grew up in one. My grandfather was a carpenter, built houses when craftsmanship meant something, taught me that everything worth keeping was worth fixing properly. I looked up from the tiny springs and pins scattered across the newspaper she'd laid out. What about you? Always lived here? Moved back about 2 years ago? She settled into the chair across from me, chin propped on her hand. After my divorce, seemed like the right time to come home. The way she said it was matter of fact, not looking for sympathy or sharing too much too soon, but honest enough that I felt like she was trusting me with something real. I'd learned to read people in this job. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You go into someone's home, you see their life up close. You develop a sense for when someone's been through something. Sometimes coming home is the bravest thing you can do, I said, focusing on cleaning the lock cylinder with a small wire. Brush, is that experience talking? I glanced up. She was studying me with those green eyes, not pushing, but genuinely curious. Moved back here myself about 4 years ago. Different reasons, but yeah. Sometimes you need familiar ground under your feet to figure out what comes next. We worked in comfortable silence after that, her occasionally handing me tools or holding pieces while I cleaned and adjusted. Her hands were steady, competent, and I noticed calluses that spoke of real work, not just teaching. The paint smudges told a story, too. Not just weekend hobby painting, but the kind of stains that come from hours spent lost in creation. You paint professionally? I asked, nodding toward the canvases visible in the living room. Teaching pays the bills, but I've been working on a series for a local gallery. Riverside street scenes, mostly. Trying to capture the way the light hits the old buildings downtown in the early morning. That's the mural on the side of the coffee shop on Main Street, isn't it? The one with the vintage cars? Her face lit up. You notice that? Drive past it every morning on my way to jobs. Always thought it made the whole block look more alive. The pride in her expression was infectious. Here was someone who created beauty in the world, who saw ordinary streets and found art in them. It made fixing her doorknob feel like more than just another service call. By the time I had the mechanism cleaned and reassembled, the afternoon light was slanting through her windows at that golden angle that photographers love. The lock turned smooth as silk now, the brass gleaming where I'd polished away years of tarnish and grime. Try it, I said, stepping back. She approached the door almost ceremoniously, placed her hand on the knob and turned. It opened effortlessly, closed with a satisfying click, opened again. She turned to me with that same expression I mentioned at the beginning, like I'd performed some kind of miracle instead of just doing basic maintenance. It's perfect, she said softly. It feels like the door I remember from childhood. Should be good for another 30 years with regular maintenance. She insisted on making coffee then, despite my protests that I should let her get back to her day. But something about the way she moved around her kitchen, the easy way conversation flowed between us, made me realize I didn't want to leave just yet. Her coffee was strong and real, served in mismatched mugs that felt better in your hands than any matching set. We sat on her back porch, looking out at a garden that was clearly her pride and joy. Tomatoes heavy on the vine, herbs that filled the air with fragrance, flowers chosen for color and scent rather than trendy landscaping. Everything about this woman's life seemed intentional, chosen, crafted with care. Can I ask you something? She said, cradling her mug in both hands. Shoot, do you ever feel like you're living someone else's idea of what your life should look like? The question caught me off guard. Not just the words, but the way she asked it, like she'd been carrying it around for a while and finally found someone safe enough to share it with. Every day for about 10 years, I admitted. That's actually why I moved back here. Got tired of pretending to be someone I wasn't. She nodded slowly. I spent 22 years married to a man who had very specific ideas about what a wife should be, what a mother should prioritize, what dreams were practical, and which ones were selfish indulgences. Took me way too long to realize I'd disappeared somewhere along the way. Kids? I asked gently. 2, both in college now, both. Incredible humans who somehow turned out amazing despite their parents' mess. They visit when they can, but they have their own lives to build. She smiled, but there was a wistfulness to it. Empty nest took some getting used to. The afternoon stretched longer than either of us had planned. We talked about everything, and nothing. Her art, my work, the way Riverside had changed over the years, books we'd read, places we wanted to travel. Easy conversation that felt like reconnecting with an old friend, rather than getting to know a stranger. When I finally packed up my tools, the sun was setting, painting her garden in shades of gold and amber. She walked me to the van, hands tucked into her back pockets in a way that made her seem younger, less guarded. She said, not just for the door, for the afternoon. It's been a while since I had a conversation that didn't revolve around lesson plans or grocery lists. Thank you for the coffee and the company. I was loading the last of my tools when she spoke again, voice softer now, more uncertain. Jake, would it be completely inappropriate if I asked whether you'd like to come back sometime? Not for work, I mean, just to talk. I turned to look at her fully. Margaret, standing in the driveway of her childhood home, paint still under her fingernails, asking a question that took more courage than she was letting on. In the dying light, she looked both confident and vulnerable, like someone who'd decided to take a chance on something real. It wouldn't be inappropriate at all, I said. I'd like that. The smile that spread across her face could have powered the streetlights that were just beginning to flicker on throughout the neighborhood. As I drove away, I caught myself glancing in the rearview mirror more than necessary, watching her figure grow smaller as she stood in her driveway, waving. Something had shifted that afternoon, something that had nothing to do with door hardware and everything to do. It's the way two people could connect over coffee and honest conversation. I didn't know it yet, but that doorknob repair would turn out to be the easiest part of what was coming. Because fixing things is simple when you understand how they work. People, relationships, hearts that have been hurt and rebuilt too many times. That's where things get complicated and beautiful and terrifying. But that first afternoon, driving home through the familiar streets of Riverside with the taste of good coffee still in my mouth and the memory of green eyes that saw more than they should, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The dangerous kind that makes you believe in second chances and new beginnings, even when you know better. Even when you know that some things, once broken, can never really be fixed the same way twice. 3 days passed before I found a reason to drive down her street again. Not intentionally, I told myself. Just happened to have a job 2 blocks over replacing a bathroom faucet for Mrs. Chen. But when I finished early and took the long way back to the main road, I slowed down as I passed number 42. Margaret's car was in the driveway, a sage green Honda that looked well-maintained but not precious. The kind of car chosen for reliability rather than status. I was debating whether stopping by unannounced would seem eager or stalkerish when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Hi Jake, it's Margaret. My kitchen sink decided to join the rebellion. Any chance you're free this week? Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by the realization that I was grinning. At my phone like a teenager? I pulled over and called her back. Jake Martinez, professional rebellion suppressor, I said when she answered. Her laugh was warm, genuine. Thank goodness. I was worried I'd have to start washing dishes in the bathtub. What's it doing? The faucet handle turns, but nothing comes out. Well, occasionally it bursts to life like a geyser, soaks everything in a 3-foot radius, then goes back to being stubborn. Sounds like a pressure issue. Could be the aerator, could be something in the supply line. I could swing by this afternoon. If you want, that would be amazing. Fair warning though, I'm covered in paint and the kitchen's a disaster. I got inspired this morning and lost track of time. When I arrived an hour later, She wasn't kidding about the paint. She answered the door with cobalt blue streaked through her hair and what looked like an entire sunset smeared across her apron. But her eyes were bright with the kind of energy that comes from creating something meaningful. "Sorry," she said, gesturing at herself. "I was working on a piece for the gallery showing, and you know how it is when you're in the zone. Don't apologize. You look like someone who's been doing what they love." The kitchen sink was indeed rebellious. When I turned the handle, nothing happened for 5 seconds. Then water exploded out with enough force to hit the window above. Margaret stood behind me, towel ready. See, it's like it's mocking me. I crouched down to examine the connections. Under the sink? When did this start? Yesterday morning. I was making coffee, turned on the tap to fill the pot, and suddenly, I'm in the middle of a water fight I didn't sign up for. The problem was immediately obvious once I got a flashlight under there. Someone had installed a fancy new aerator. Without accounting for the old plumbing's pressure system, it's probably a well-meaning previous repair that created more problems than it solved. "Good news and bad news," I said, emerging from under the sink. "Good news is, it's fixable and won't cost much. Bad news is, whoever installed this aerator didn't know what they were doing." "That would be my ex-husband," she said with a rueful smile. "He was very handy until you actually needed something to work properly." There was no bitterness in her voice, just the weary amusement of someone who'd learned to laugh at old frustrations. I liked that about her, the way she didn't carry anger like baggage. I worked. She painted at the kitchen table, occasionally glancing over to watch my progress. The piece she was working on was a street scene, but not the touristy postcard kind. This was real Riverside, the way it looked at 7 in the morning. When the coffee shops were just opening and the light hit the old brick buildings with honest warmth. "You really see this place," I said during a break, studying the canvas over her shoulder. "Most people drive through downtown and see outdated buildings that need updating. You see character? Character comes from time and use," she said, adding a touch of golden light to a storefront window. "These buildings have stories. People met here, fell in love, started businesses, raised families. Seems wrong to cover all that history with generic modern facades. Is that why you moved back? The history?" She set down her brush and considered the question. "Partly, but also because I needed to remember who I was before I became who I thought I should be." Feeling more than she knew? After my divorce 3 years earlier, I'd spent months feeling like I was wearing someone else's clothes, living in someone else's idea of success. My ex-wife had very specific plans for our future, and I'd gone along with them so completely that I'd forgotten what I actually wanted. It took moving back to Riverside, taking over my grandfather's old tools, and rediscovering the satisfaction of fixing things with my hands to feel like myself again. "How's that working out?" I asked. "Some days better than others, turns out. Rediscovering yourself is messier than anyone tells you." The sink repair took longer than necessary because we kept getting distracted by conversation. She told me about her students, teenagers who rolled their eyes at anything older than last week, but secretly loved learning about color theory and composition. I told her about my grandfather, who'd taught me that every repair was a conversation between old craftsmanship and new problems. "He sounds like he was a wise man," she said when I finished a story about learning to read, "would grain like a book. He died when I was in college, but I still hear his voice sometimes when I'm working. Measure twice, cut once, and never. Force something that doesn't want to fit." Good advice for more than just carpentry. When I finished with the sink, the afternoon light was starting to slant through her windows in that way that made everything look like a painting. The water flowed smooth and steady now. No more geysers or stubborn dry spells. "Perfect," she said, testing the handle. "You're officially my hero, just doing my job." "No, you're not. Your job was fixing the sink," listening to me ramble. "About art and life philosophy? That was kindness." Before I could respond, she was moving toward the refrigerator. "Stay for dinner? It's the least I can do, and I was going to make pasta anyway." I should have said no. Should have maintained professional boundaries, collected my fee, and gone home to my quiet apartment with its bachelor furniture and TV dinner routine. But something about the way she asked, hopeful but not desperate, made me want to stay in. Her warm kitchen, with its mismatched chairs and walls covered in her artwork, only if you let me help cook. Dinner became an exercise in comfortable chaos. She was one of those cooks who seasoned by instinct and tasted everything twice, while I was more of a follow-the-recipe type. But somehow we found a rhythm. Her improvising while I chopped vegetables with the precision my grandfather had taught me. You know, for a contractor, you're surprisingly good with a knife, she observed, watching me dice onions with methodical care. For an art teacher, you're surprisingly fearless with seasoning. Life's too short for bland food. Out. We ate on her back porch as the sun set, pasta with fresh herbs from her garden, and a bottle of wine she'd been saving for no particular occasion. The conversation drifted from work to travel dreams to books we'd read, the kind of meandering talk that happens when two people are genuinely curious about each other. "Can I ask you something?" she said as we finished the wine. "Seems to be our thing now. Why did you really become a handyman? I mean, you're clearly educated. You could probably do anything you wanted." I twirled the last of my pasta, considering how honest to be. I tried the corporate thing for a while. Marketing consultant, if you can believe that. Spent my days in meetings about meetings, creating solutions for problems that didn't exist, made good money, had the right zip code, looked successful on paper. But I felt like I was disappearing a little more every day, like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. The marriage fell apart, the job felt meaningless, and I realized I hadn't felt genuinely useful in years. "So you came home?" So I came home, started fixing things for people, and discovered that being needed for something real felt better than being successful at something hollow. She nodded slowly. "I understand that more than you know. Your turn. What did you want to be when you were young, before you became what you thought you should be?" "An artist?" "Just an artist. I was going to move to San Francisco, rent a tiny studio, paint until my hands fell off, and figure out how to make it work." She smiled at the memory. "Then I met Robert in college, and he was so practical, so sure about the future. Teaching was stable," he said. "Art was a nice hobby, but not a real career, and I loved him, so I listened." "Do you regret it, the teaching?" "No. I love my students. And there's something beautiful about watching young people discover they can create. But I regret listening when someone told me my dreams were impractical. I regret waiting 22 years to pick up where I left off." The honesty in her voice made my chest tight. Here was someone who'd lost herself and was actively working to find her way back. Someone who understood the difference between what looked good from the outside and what felt right from within. "For what it's worth," I said, "your art is incredible. And you're not starting over. You're building on everything you learned along the way." "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." We sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around us, the garden releasing the day's stored scents of tomatoes and jasmine. String lights came on automatically in neighboring yards, and somewhere down the street, someone was practicing piano with determined imperfection. "I should probably go," I said eventually, though I didn't want to. "Probably," she agreed, but she didn't move to clear the dishes. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the van again, hands tucked into the pockets of her cardigan. The evening air was cooling, and I could smell rain approaching from the west. "Jake," she said as I loaded my toolbox. "Yeah, this is going to sound forward, but would you like to come to the gallery opening on Friday? It's just a small local thing, wine and cheese and people pretending to understand art. But I'd love to have a friendly face there." The invitation caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because of how much I wanted to say yes. I'd be honored. Fair warning, though, I know nothing about art. Good. The people who think they know everything about art are usually the most boring. As I drove home, I found myself already looking forward to Friday, to seeing her work displayed properly, to meeting the part of her world that existed beyond kitchen repairs and back porch conversations. But underneath the anticipation was something else, something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea how deep the water was below. Margaret was unlike anyone I'd met in years. Not just attractive, though she was that. but substantial. Someone with depth and history and the kind of quiet strength that comes from surviving disappointment and choosing to hope anyway. The kind of woman who could make a man forget about keeping things simple and safe. It's the kind of woman who could change everything if you let her. That night, lying in bed, listening to the rain start against my windows, I realized I was already letting her. 3 repair calls, 2 dinners, and countless hours of conversation had somehow shifted the foundation of my carefully ordered life. I was 42 years old, supposedly past the age of falling for someone like a teenager with his first crush, but there was no denying what was happening. The question was whether I was brave enough to see where it led, or smart enough to know when to step back before I got in too deep. Because Margaret wasn't the kind of woman you dated casually or loved halfway. She was the kind who deserved everything, and I wasn't sure I remembered how to give that much of myself to anyone. But Friday was still 4 days away, and maybe by then I'd figure out which version of myself I wanted to be. Friday couldn't come fast enough, but when it did, I spent 20 minutes staring at my closet like it held the secrets of the universe. What did one wear to an art gallery opening in Riverside? My usual work clothes felt too casual, but the one suit I owned seemed like trying too hard. I settled on dark jeans, a button-down shirt, and a blazer that had seen better days but still looked respectable. The Riverside Arts Collective occupied a converted warehouse downtown. Brick walls and industrial lighting that someone had transformed into something that felt both modern and timeless. I arrived fashionably late, or what I hoped was fashionably late. I found the place buzzing with the kind of energy that comes when creative people gather to celebrate one of their own. Margaret stood near the back wall where her paintings were displayed, wearing a black dress that was simple but elegant, her hair loose around her shoulders. She was animated, gesturing as she spoke to a small group, more confident and radiant than I'd ever seen her. This was her element, her world. And watching her in it made me realize how much of herself she'd been holding back during our quiet conversations. I grabbed a glass of wine from the table near the entrance and made my way through the crowd, studying her work as I went. The paintings were even more impressive, displayed professionally. She'd captured something essential about Riverside, the soul of a place that existed between its past and its uncertain future. There was love in every brushstroke, but also honesty about the ways time and neglect had marked the building she'd chosen to memorialize. "You came," she said when she spotted me, her face lighting up in a way that made the wine and cheese crowd fade into background noise. "I wouldn't have missed it. These are incredible, Margaret." "Really? Thank you." Expecting someone to tell me I don't belong here, that this is all some mistake. "Trust me, you belong here." She introduced me to the other artists, gallery owners, and local art enthusiasts, describing me simply as my friend Jake, without explanation or apology. I appreciated that she didn't feel the need to justify my presence or explain our connection. In her world tonight, I was simply someone she wanted there. The evening was going perfectly until I excused myself to get another glass of wine and found myself face to face with a man who was clearly looking for Margaret. He was tall, well-dressed in the way that spoke of money rather than taste, silver hair, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no about anything important. "Excuse me," he said. "Not really excusing anything. I'm looking for Margaret Chen, the artist." "She's over by her paintings," I said, nodding toward where she stood talking to an elderly couple about color techniques. "And you are?" Was something in his tone, proprietary and slightly challenging, that immediately put me on edge. "Jake Martinez, friend of Margaret's." "Robert Chen," he said, extending a hand with the firm grip of someone who'd learned that first impressions mattered in business. "Margaret's husband." The words hit me like a physical blow. Husband, present tense, not ex-husband as she'd referred. To him, I must have looked as confused as I felt, because his expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy. If it hadn't been tinged with satisfaction, "I'm sorry, she probably didn't mention me. We're separated, working through some things. Marriage counseling, you understand. These artistic phases of hers can be challenging, but we're committed to making it work." I felt like the floor had shifted beneath my feet. Everything I thought I knew about Margaret's situation, about her divorce, about her freedom to start something new, suddenly felt uncertain. I watched Robert scan the crowd until he spotted her, his expression shifting. To something warmer? More familiar? "If you'll excuse me," he said. "I want to surprise her. She doesn't know I'm here." I watched him approach Margaret, watched her face cycle through shock, confusion, and something that looked like resignation. He kissed her cheek, placed his hand on the small of her back with casual ownership, and began introducing himself to the people she'd been speaking with. I couldn't hear the conversation from across the room, but I could see the change in her posture, the way she seemed to shrink slightly beside him. The rational part of my brain knew I should leave. Whatever was happening between Margaret and her husband, separated or not, working things out or not, was none of my business. I was the contractor who'd fixed her doorknob, shared a few meals, and apparently misunderstood the situation completely. But the larger part of me, the part that had spent hours talking with her about dreams, deferred and second chances, couldn't reconcile the confident woman I'd been getting to know with the diminished version standing beside Robert. This wasn't the same person who'd laughed over pasta on her back porch or painted with fearless strokes in her kitchen. I stayed longer than I should have, nursing my wine and pretending to study other artists' work while keeping Margaret in peripheral vision. Robert never left her side, steering conversations, correcting small details in her descriptions of the paintings, and generally behaving like someone who'd appointed himself her manager rather than her support system. When I finally couldn't stand watching anymore, I made my way over to say goodbye. Margaret's eyes met mine with an expression that was part apology, part plea, and part warning. "Jake, I'd like you to meet my husband, Robert," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "We actually met at the wine table," Robert said smoothly. "Jake was just telling me how much he admires Margaret's work." "I was telling the truth," I said, looking directly at Margaret. "It's exceptional. She's always been talented," Robert said, his arm tightening slightly around Margaret's waist. "I'm just glad she's finally found a productive outlet for her creativity." The condescension in his tone made my jaw clench, but Margaret's subtle shake of the head kept me from responding. This wasn't my fight, and causing a scene at her gallery opening wouldn't help anyone. "Congratulations on the show," I said to Margaret. "Thank you for inviting me." "Thank you for coming," she replied, and in those simple words I heard volumes of things she couldn't say. I left the gallery with more questions than answers, and a sick feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with the cheap wine. The drive home gave me time to replay every conversation Margaret and I had shared, looking for clues I'd missed, signs I'd misinterpreted. She'd definitely said ex-husband. She'd talked about her divorce, about learning to live alone, about rediscovering herself after 22 years of marriage. But marriages are complicated things, and people sometimes say what they wish were true rather than what actually is. Maybe they were separated but not divorced. Maybe the divorce wasn't final. Maybe she'd been as confused about the situation as I apparently was. Or maybe Robert was lying, manipulating the situation for reasons I couldn't understand. The way he'd spoken about marriage counseling and artistic phases had sounded rehearsed, like something he'd said before to other people in similar situations. I spent the weekend alternating between anger and understanding, between feeling betrayed and feeling foolish for assuming I understood a situation that was clearly more complex than Margaret had let on. By Monday morning, I decided that the professional thing to do was to step back and let her sort out whatever was happening in her personal life without the complication of feelings that had apparently been inappropriate from the start. That resolution lasted exactly until my phone rang Monday afternoon. "Jake, it's Margaret. Can we talk?" Her voice sounded strained, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," I said, though saying it felt like swallowing glass. "Please, I know Friday was confusing, and I owe you an explanation. Can you come over? Or I can meet you somewhere if that's better." Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing to stop by after work. The Margaret who answered the door looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore no makeup, and her eyes were red-rimmed in a way that suggested recent tears. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I wasn't sure you would." The house felt different somehow, less like the warm sanctuary I'd come to know, and more like a stage where an uncomfortable drama was playing out. Robert's presence lingered in small details. A coffee mug in the sink that wasn't Margaret's usual ceramic. A leather jacket draped over a kitchen chair. Newspapers folded in a way she never folded them. "He's not here," she said, following my gaze. "Went back to San Diego this morning. His work, you know." We sat at her kitchen table, the same place where we'd shared easy conversation and growing connection just days earlier. Now the space felt charged with tension and unspoken complications. "I lied to you," she said without preamble. "Not intentionally, but I lied by omission, and that's not fair. About the divorce, about everything being settled, about being free to start over." She wrapped her hands around a mug of tea that had gone cold while she'd waited for me to arrive. "Robert and I are separated, have been for 8 months. But the divorce isn't final. He keeps finding ways to delay it. Reasons we should try again. Promises that he's changed. And you believe him? I want to. Part of me still wants to believe that 22 years of marriage means something. That the man I fell in love with in college is still in there somewhere. But then he shows up at my gallery opening without asking. Starts managing my conversations like I'm incapable of speaking for myself. How did I remember why I left in the first place? I wanted to reach across the table and take her hands, but everything felt different now. It's complicated by the presence of a husband who might or might not be her ex-husband, depending on which day you asked. "What does he want?" I asked. "Control. He wants me to move back to San Diego, give up the house, give up teaching here, give up the art seriously. He's willing to let me keep painting as long as it doesn't interfere with being the wife he needs for his business social obligations." "And what do you want?" "I want to be free to figure that out without someone else deciding for me." She looked up from her tea, meeting my eyes for the first time since I'd arrived. "I want to be free to explore whatever this is between us. Without feeling like I'm cheating on someone I'm not even sure I'm still married to emotionally." The honesty in her voice made my chest tight. Here was the woman I'd been falling for. The one who painted fearlessly and talked about dreams with passion. Not the diminished version who'd stood beside Robert at the gallery. "Margaret," I said carefully, "I can't be part of something that hurts you or makes your situation more complicated than it already is. I know, and I wouldn't ask you to be. But I also can't pretend that these feelings aren't real just because the timing is messy." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm 47 years old. I've spent most of my adult life being practical, making safe choices, putting other people's needs before my own. And for the first time in decades, I met someone who makes me remember what it feels. I like to be excited about the future instead of just resigned to it." She reached across the table then, her fingers brushing mine. "I'm saying I'm scared, Jake. Scared that if I don't fight for what I want this time, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." The words hung between us, honest and vulnerable, and absolutely terrifying in their implications. Because what she was describing wasn't just attraction or companionship. It was the kind of connection that changes everything, that makes you willing to risk security for the possibility of something real. "What if this is real?"
"Oh,"
she whispered, her eyes searching mine. "What if this is the thing I've been waiting for without knowing I was waiting?" I looked at this woman who'd somehow become essential to my days, who'd made me remember what it felt like to be genuinely needed by someone whose opinion mattered. Margaret, with her paint-stained fingers and her fearless art and her determination to rebuild herself into someone she could respect. "Then we figure it out," I said, turning my hand palm up so our fingers could interlock properly. "One day at a time, one honest conversation at a time. But Margaret, I need you to know that I'm not interested in being anyone's secret or anyone's backup plan. If we're going to do this, we do it right. I wouldn't want it any other way." But even as we sat there, hands linked across her kitchen table, I knew we were stepping into territory that would test both of us in ways we couldn't predict. Because love, real love, is never simple, and when it comes later in life, it carries the weight of everything that came before. All the mistakes, and compromises and dreams deferred, all the ways we'd learned to protect ourselves from disappointment. Somewhere in San Diego, Robert was probably planning his next move, his next attempt to reclaim a marriage that Margaret was finally ready to leave behind. The easy part was over. Came the hard work of building something new while dismantling something old, and hoping that what we were creating together would be strong enough to survive the process. 2 weeks later, Margaret's kitchen faucet started acting up again. Not the same problem I'd fixed before, but a new issue with the hot water valve that required parts I didn't have in the van. Normal procedure would have been to order the parts, schedule a follow-up appointment, and handle it like any other service call. Instead, I found myself making excuses to come by more often, stretching a simple repair into multiple visits because neither of us was ready to admit how much we looked forward to these ordinary moments together. The pretense was getting thinner. Each day, we both knew the faucet could wait, that the slow drip wasn't an emergency. But we'd fallen into a routine of coffee and conversation that felt as necessary as breathing. Margaret would be painting when I arrived. We'd end up talking for hours about everything except the growing tension between what we wanted and what was practical. "I think you're avoiding actually fixing that faucet," she said on a Wednesday afternoon, watching me organize my tools with unnecessary precision. "I think you're avoiding calling a different repair service," I countered. "Maybe we're both avoiding the obvious." She was right, of course. We were dancing around each other, testing boundaries, building something fragile and precious in the spaces between professional necessity and personal desire. Bubbles. The intrusion came in the form of Margaret's daughter, Emma, who arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon while I was supposedly installing a new valve assembly. I heard a car door slam in the driveway, followed by footsteps that approached with purpose rather than casual visitation. "Mom." A voice called from the front door, followed immediately by the sound of someone letting themselves in with their own key. Margaret's face went pale. "Emma? She wasn't supposed to be here until next weekend." Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway. Moments later, a young woman in her early 20s, with Margaret's eyes and an expression that took in the domestic scene with sharp intelligence. She looked from her mother to me to the tools spread across the counter, clearly calculating the mathematics of what she was witnessing. "Hi," she said carefully. "I'm Emma. And you are?" "Jake Martinez," I said, standing up from where I'd been. Crouched beside the sink. "I'm fixing your mom's faucet." "That's a lot of tools for a faucet repair." Emma was direct in the way of people who'd learned not to accept surface explanations at face value. She hugged her mother with genuine warmth, but her eyes kept returning to me with curious assessment. "How long has this repair been going on?" she asked, with the kind of innocence that wasn't innocent at all. "Couple weeks," Margaret said. "Complex problem, must be." Emma accepted her mother's explanation with a smile that suggested she wasn't buying it for a second. "I came early because I wanted to surprise you. Guess I succeeded." The afternoon that followed was an exercise in careful navigation. Emma was clearly protective of her mother, but also genuinely warm and funny in a way that reminded me why. Margaret spoke of her children with such pride. She asked intelligent questions about the repair work, told stories about her graduate program in environmental science, and managed to gather what felt like a comprehensive background check's worth of information about me without ever seeming invasive. "So you've been back in Riverside for 4 years?" she said over the impromptu lunch Margaret had thrown together. "What brought you home?" "Sometimes you need familiar ground to figure out what comes next," I said, consciously echoing something I'd told Margaret weeks earlier. "And what came next?" "This," I said, gesturing around Margaret's kitchen, "helping people fix things that matter to them." "What?" Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Mom says you really understand old houses. That's rare these days," your grandfather taught me, that everything worth keeping is worth maintaining properly. He sounds like he was a wise man. He was. Would have loved your mom's place. He had a thing for houses with good bones and people who cared about preserving character instead of just updating for trends. I caught Margaret smiling at that and realized I'd just revealed more about my feelings than I'd intended. Emma caught it too, if the knowing look she shared with her mother was any indication. The peaceful afternoon shattered when Robert's BMW pulled into the driveway without warning. Through the kitchen window, we watched him emerge from the driver's seat with the confident stride of someone who still considered this his territory. Emma's expression darkened immediately.
"What's he doing here?"
she asked, no longer bothering. To hide her irritation? "I don't know," Margaret said, but something in her voice suggested she suspected. Robert entered through the front door with the familiarity of someone who'd never accepted that he no longer lived there. He called out greetings as he approached the kitchen, his voice carrying the hearty warmth he reserved for family occasions and business presentations. "Emma, sweetheart," said, embracing his daughter with genuine affection. "I hoped I'd catch you here, Dad." Emma's hug was dutiful, but noticeably cooler than the one she'd given her mother. Robert's gaze moved to me with recognition and something that might have been displeasure. "Jake, right? Still working on that faucet? Just finishing up?" said, beginning to pack my tools with deliberate efficiency. It'd be quite a complex repair to require so many visits. The challenge in his tone was barely veiled, and I saw Margaret's shoulders tense in response. This wasn't about plumbing, and we all knew it. "Sometimes the right approach takes time," I said evenly. "In my experience, most problems have straightforward solutions if you know what you're doing." The conversation was heading toward confrontation when Emma intervened with the practiced ease of someone who'd been managing her parents' tensions. "For years, Dad, what brings you up here? Thought you weren't coming until next month. Change of plans. I wanted to discuss some family matters with your mother. And to spend time with you, of course." "What kind of family matters?" Emma asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Robert settled into the kitchen chair like he was reclaiming his place at the table. "Your mother and I have been talking about reconciliation. I think it's time we stopped this separation nonsense and worked on rebuilding what we had." Silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stared at her hands. Emma looked between her parents with obvious frustration, and I felt like an intruder in a family drama that was about to explode. "Mom," Emma said quietly, "is that what you want?" Margaret looked up, her eyes meeting mine briefly before returning to her daughter. "It's complicated, Em." "No, it's not," Emma said with surprising firmness. "Either you want to be married to Dad or you don't. Either you're happy with the life you've built together or you're not." "What's complicated about that?" Robert's expression shifted to something harder. "Emma, you don't understand the complexities of a long marriage. Sometimes people need time apart to appreciate what they have. I understand that Mom has been happier in the last 8 months than I've seen her in years," Emma shot back. "I understand that she's painting again, really painting, not just dabbing at canvases when she has spare time. I understand that she laughs differently now, like she means it." "Art is a wonderful hobby," Robert said with patronizing patience, "but it's not a foundation for life decisions." "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about," Emma said, her voice rising. "You still don't get it. Mom's art isn't a hobby. It's who she is when she's not trying to be who you think she should be." I stood up, tools finally packed, feeling like I was witnessing something too private for outsiders. "I should go. Margaret, everything's working fine now. Call me if you have any other problems." "Jake, wait," Margaret said. But Robert was already standing, moving to block the natural path to the door. "Actually, I think we should all talk," Robert said. "Clear the air. Jake, you seem like a decent guy, but I think there's been some confusion. About my wife's availability." The word wife hung in the air like a challenge. I felt my jaw clench but forced myself to stay calm. "There's no confusion," I said. "Margaret is free to make her own choices about who she spends time with. Is she? Because last I checked, we're still married, still working on our relationship, still committed to our family." "Robert, stop," Margaret said, standing up from the table. "This isn't fair to anyone. What's not fair is leading this man on when you know perfectly well that our situation is temporary." Emma slammed her hand on the table hard enough to make everyone jump. "Enough, Dad. You left. You walked out because Mom wasn't the perfect corporate wife you wanted anymore. You don't get to come back whenever it's convenient and act like nothing changed. I left because your mother was having some kind of midlife crisis that was affecting our entire family." "I left," Margaret said quietly, "because I realized I'd spent 22 years becoming someone I didn't recognize, and I'm not going back to that, Robert. Not for you, not for anyone." The words seemed to surprise her as much as they did the rest of us. She'd been dancing around this truth for weeks, but saying it out loud in front of her husband and daughter felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Robert's face went through several expressions before settling on something between hurt and anger. "Margaret, you're being emotional. This contractor has obviously confused you about what you want." "Don't," I said, my patience finally exhausted. Don't blame me for your wife's unhappiness. I didn't create the problems in your marriage. It just happened to show up after she'd already decided she deserved better. Better. You think a handyman is better than everything I've given her? I think someone who listens to her is better than someone who talks over her. I think someone who sees her art as essential instead of decorative is better than someone who treats her dreams like inconveniences. The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of the newly repaired faucet dripping slightly, a rhythm that seemed to count out the seconds while everyone processed what had just been said. Emma was the first to speak. "Mom, is this real? What you have with Jake?" Margaret looked at me, then at her daughter, then at her husband, who was waiting for her to deny everything and return to the safety of the familiar. "I'm 47 years old," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared that I waited too long to figure out what I actually want. I'm scared that I don't know how to be happy without feeling guilty about it. And I'm scared that this thing with Jake might be the most real thing I've felt in decades. I'll mess it up because I don't know how to trust my own feelings anymore." The honesty in her voice was devastating and beautiful and absolutely terrifying. This was the moment we'd been building toward for weeks. It's the moment when all the careful boundaries and professional pretenses fell away and left nothing but raw truth. "But mostly," she continued, looking directly at Robert, "I'm scared that if I don't choose my own life this time, I'll never get another chance." Robert stared at his wife like she'd spoken in a foreign language. Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hand. And I stood there with my toolbox, realizing that everything was about to change in ways none of us could predict. Because sometimes the most important repairs aren't the ones you can fix with tools and replacement parts. Sometimes you have to be willing to tear down what's broken and build something entirely new, even when you're not sure what the finished product will look like. The kitchen fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Not tense, with unspoken things, but heavy with the weight of decisions that couldn't be postponed any longer. Robert left that evening without another word, his BMW disappearing into the darkness like a threat that had finally lost its power. Emma stayed 3 more days, during which she and Margaret had the kinds of conversations that 20 years of careful family diplomacy had postponed. I kept my distance during those days, understanding that some battles have to be fought within families before they can be resolved between individuals. When Emma finally hugged me goodbye on Sunday afternoon, she whispered, "Take care of her. She deserves someone who sees how extraordinary she is." "I know," I whispered back. "I will." The weeks that followed were quieter, but not in the way that suggests problems have been swept under rugs. This was the kind of quiet that comes after storms. When the air feels cleaner and you can finally see the landscape clearly, Margaret threw herself into her art with renewed intensity, working on a new series that captured Riverside not as it was, but as it could be. Buildings restored to their former glory, streets alive with community, spaces where people gathered and connected instead of just passing through. She filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning in October, walking into the courthouse with the same determined calm she brought to her painting. I offered to go with her, but she said this was something she needed to do alone. When she came home that afternoon, she found me installing new weather stripping around her front door, preparing the house for winter. "How does it feel?" I asked, looking up from my work. "Scary. Liberating, right?" She sat down on the front steps beside me. "It's like I'm finally telling the truth about my own life." "Any regrets? Only that it took me so long? You didn't? Talk about the future that day, or the day after, or even the week after." We were both smart enough to know that relationships built on the ruins of other relationships need time to find their own foundation. Instead, we settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than desperate. Dinner twice a week, weekend mornings in her garden, evening walks through downtown Riverside, where she pointed out architectural details I'd never noticed, and I told her stories about the families who'd lived behind those windows decades ago. The turning point came in November, during the first real rainstorm of the season. Margaret called at 6 in the morning, her voice tight with panic. "Jake, I think my roof is leaking. There's water coming through the ceiling in the guest bedroom, and I don't know what to do." I was there in 20 minutes, flashlight in hand, ready to crawl around in her attic and assess the damage. The leak was significant but fixable, probably. caused by loose shingles that had finally given way after years of holding on by faith and stubbornness. "How bad is it?" she asked as I climbed down from the attic access, dust and insulation in my hair. "Bad enough that you can't ignore it. Not bad enough to panic. I can patch it temporarily today and do the real repair once the storm passes." Thank God I was imagining having to move out, starting over somewhere else. Something in her voice, the genuine relief mixed with underlying fear, made me pause. This wasn't just about roof repairs. "Margaret, you know I'm not going anywhere, right? Storm or no storm, leak or no leak. I'm here." She looked at me with those green eyes that had seen too much disappointment to trust easily. "But we're learning to hope again anyway, even when it gets complicated. Even when there are problems that can't be fixed with tools. Especially then." That night, while rain drummed against her newly patched roof and wind rattled windows that had weathered 50 years of storms, we finally talked about the future, not in grand terms or dramatic declarations, but in the practical. The language of people who'd learned that love was something you built day by day rather than fell into all at once. "I want to keep the house," she said, curled up beside me on her couch while the storm raged outside. "Good, it suits you."
"I want
to keep teaching, but maybe cut back to part-time so I can focus more on painting. The kids need teachers who understand that creativity matters. I want to travel. See the places I've only painted from photographs. Where do you want to go first?" "Italy. Tuscany specifically. Want to see how light falls on those hillside towns in person. Sounds perfect." She was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain. "Oh, I want to do all of that with someone who understands that I'm not looking for someone to complete me. I'm looking for someone to explore life alongside. That sounds like something I could do, even though I'm 47 and set in my ways and probably too independent for my own good, especially because of that." She smiled then. Kind of smile that starts small and spreads until it transforms everything. "What about you? What do you want?" "I want to keep fixing things for people who appreciate good work. I want to wake up every morning excited about the day ahead instead of just resigned to getting through it. I want to build something lasting. With someone who values craftsmanship over convenience." "Anything else?" "I want to learn to paint. You've inspired me to try creating something instead of just maintaining what other people created. I could teach you. I was hoping you'd say that." 6 months later, Margaret's divorce was final. Her new paintings were selling in galleries as far away as Los Angeles. And I'd moved into the guest bedroom that we'd converted into a shared workspace, half art studio, half organized tool storage. It was a perfect metaphor for what we'd built together. Two separate people with distinct skills and dreams, creating something new without losing what made each of us whole. Emma visited for Christmas and spent an afternoon helping me hang Margaret's latest painting, a street scene that captured the coffee shop where we'd had our first real conversation outside of repair work. While we worked, she told me stories about her mother's art from when she was growing up. How Margaret would paint late at night after everyone else was asleep, as if creativity was something that had to be hidden. "Oh, she's different now, Emma," said, stepping back to assess our hanging job. "More herself, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense. Thank you for seeing who she really was. Thank you for trusting me to take care of her." That evening, while Margaret finished dinner and Emma set the table with the good china they'd hardly ever used when Robert lived there, I found myself thinking about the chain of small events that had led to this moment. A stubborn doorknob that could have been fixed by any contractor in town, a woman brave enough to ask a stranger to stay for coffee, conversations that wandered from repair, work to real life. Two people willing to risk the safety of loneliness for the possibility of connection. Jake, Margaret called from the kitchen, "Can you help me carry the roast?" I looked around the dining room, decorated with Margaret's paintings and filled with the laughter of people who'd chosen to become family, rather than just accepting the families they'd been born into. The doorknob I'd repaired months ago turned smoothly now, welcoming rather than resistant. A small symbol of everything that was possible. When you took the time to fix what was broken instead of just replacing it with something new, coming. I called back and meant it in every possible way. Sometimes the most important things we fix aren't the ones we get paid for. Sometimes the best repairs happen when two people decide that what they're building together is worth the patient work of getting it right. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find someone who understands that love. It's like good craftsmanship is something you choose to practice every day. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.